This is Art Viewing Adventures. We talk about art-related topics that focus usually on things in the San Francisco Bay Area. I see in chat, Jane said that the volume dropped substantially. It may be in chat, other folks can talk about whether that's still a problem. I hope not. But assuming it's not, I want to introduce my good friend, Bernice Iwamoto, who is a museum guide, and she and I have worked together at an unnamed museum of art in San Francisco. We call it SF UMA. I know you've also been affiliated with the Oakland Museum of Art,
Yes,
California. What's it?
yes, Oakland Museum of California. And I was going to say, if for those of you, not to be rude, but for those of you who cannot hear me, I think it might be your computer because my family and friends would be the first to laugh if you told them you couldn't hear me. They would be on the floor laughing really, really hard.
Yeah,
Um,
because you're not stoic, Bernice.
no, and I'm not particularly quiet. So yes. Um,
So we're going to talk about an exhibition that's currently at the Legion of Honor, which is one of the fine arts museums of San Francisco, on Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt is, well, we're going to find out about her, but a really interesting 19th century woman who was part of the Impressionist movement. And Bernice, you've done a lot of research on this, so I'll let you take it away.
all right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you about Mary Cassatt. Because when I say, the artist Mary Cassatt, you probably have images like this, right? Sentimental paintings of women and their children. However, today we're going to talk about how Mary Cassatt was actually a very modern artist who experimented not only with subject matter, but also with mediums, specifically prints and pastels. Mary Cassatt was born on May 22nd, 1844 in Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, in what's today considered Pittsburgh's North Side. Her father, Robert, was a successful stockbroker and land speculator, and her mother, Catherine Kelso Johnston, came from a prosperous banking family. And Mary Cassatt was actually a distant cousin of another artist, Robert Henry. Her family soon moved from Allegheny City and settled into Philadelphia, but they traveled extensively through Europe during Mary's childhood. And she grew up in an environment that viewed travel as an integral part of education. And she first traveled to Europe with her family at the age of 11. And during those 5 years in Europe, she visited many of the capitals, including London, Paris, and Berlin. And she had her first lessons in drawing and music while studying abroad and learning German and French. Her first exposure to French artists like Corot or Courbet it was likely during the Paris World's Fair in 1855. And by the age of 16, Mary Cassatt had decided to become a professional artist. However, in 1860, proper girls from well-to-do families like Mary's, they were not professional artists. They had polite hobbies, flower arranging, embroidery, and needlepoint. Needless to say, Mary's family did not approve of her decision to become a professional artist, but they eventually relented. And 1 month before her 16th birthday, Mary signed up for the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and she was the first student in her class to enroll. Part of her parents' concern may have been her exposure to feminist ideas and the bohemian behavior of some of the male students there. About 20% of the students were female, although most were not intending to make art a career. They viewed art as a means of achievement and recognition and a socially valuable skill. Mary Cassatt, however, was determined to become a professional artist. Not surprisingly, the male faculty and her fellow students, she found them to be patronizing and resentful of her attendance. She found the curriculum slow-paced and the course offerings inadequate. Female students at the time were not allowed to draw from live models, let alone nude models. Instead, they drew from plaster models. Mary decided to leave the program and move to Europe, where she could study the works of the old masters on her own firsthand. Despite the strong objections of her father, actually of her family, her father reportedly declared he'd rather see his daughter dead than living abroad as a bohemian. Mary left for Paris in 1856 with her mother as a chaperone. Unfortunately, at the time, women were not admitted to the famous art school, the École des Beaux-Arts. Instead, she spent much of her time copying the old masters at the Louvre, and she also took private lessons. In 1868, she became the first woman to have a work, this particular work, Mandolin Player. It was selected by the jury for inclusion in the Paris Salon. Now, the Paris Salon was the official art exhibition of the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and her art making it there was a huge milestone because between 1748 and 1890, the Paris Salon was considered to be arguably the greatest annual or biennial event of the Western world. Now, I know this particular painting is earlier, but I wanted you to be able to see how many paintings were actually accepted into the salon and how they're hung, one right on top of each other. I hope she didn't have a really, really small work at the top, honestly, because you can see it's a big room. Okay. But her early submissions to the Paris Salon were accepted, but as her style grew more radical, her reception waned within the academic art establishment. And although she felt indebted to the salon for building her career, she began to feel increasingly constrained by its inflexible guidelines. And no longer concerned with what was fashionable or commercial, she began to experiment artistically. Her new works drew some criticism for the bright colors and unflattering accuracy of the subjects. Here's an example. All right. So while many of her male fellow impressionists were focused on landscapes and street scenes, Mary Cassatt became famous for her portraits. As a woman of the 19th century Paris, she lacked the opportunity to depict diverse subject matters that were available to her male colleagues. Cafes, clubs, bordellos, even the streets were comfortably accessible for a genteel lady. The domestic realm.
Just want to jump in and just like, this is one of the paintings that's in the exhibition at the Legion.
Yes.
Fact, now, personally, it was one of my favorites.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll get to that, Rodney. Well, we'll have to ask what is it about it. You know what? Let's start with that. All right. So, what are some of the words you would use to describe this woman, and what can you tell me about her?
Well, I mean, first of all, she looks like she's kind of glowing. It's a very kind of inviting scene. I think the palette that she uses is really interesting. It's got these bright colors, and also look what she's done with the perspective. Like it's not really completely representational. You've got what she's doing with the loges in the background really interesting. So I find it really, also it's got a lot of movement to it. I get a sense of, like almost like this, like the scene is in motion.
Right. So we're seeing, this is really very different than those Renaissance paintings of like the Madonna and the cherubs and the baby Jesus. You were mentioning about about the colors. Now, I will tell you, when Mary Cassatt, she did explore this particular subject of women in theaters. Mary and her sister Lydia were in Paris, and they took advantage of many of the delights to be found there, including the opera. And her sister Lydia was often a model for Mary's paintings. And, as Rodney pointed out, we see this portrait of Lydia. She looks pretty glamorous for an evening at the opera. There's no question. And this was one of the works that was one of the first ones that was exhibited with the Impressionists. And Rodney's talking about, I think you were mentioning about those mirrors, that large mirror we see in the back of the loge, and how you were also mentioning, Rodney, about the beautiful light that we see, the light that is from the opera's glass chandelier. This is an image of what the chandelier looks like now. Don't look at the painting on the top. That's after Mary Cassatt. But you get a sense of how, it looks fabulous inside. It looks so glamorous with the beautiful light. Absolutely. Now, yeah, go ahead.
I want to just jump in a couple comments in chat.
Yes.
Gail says, that painting kind of was like rosy girl next door, innocent, excited, happy. And then Sarah was also noting that she was, the mirror kind of is an interesting element in it.
Right, and how it gives you all that beautiful light that you could see. Let's go back to that. I will tell you in regards to that light, those you were talking about that sort of the way how it gives her this beautiful look. And it sort of gives us a little bit of a sense of what it would have been like to experience that beautiful light in the opera house. It's what the French novelist and journalist and playwright Émile Zola described as a ray of light from the ceiling to the floor. Right, you get that gorgeous light there. Now, I will tell you, when this work was originally shown at the Fourth Impressionist exhibition in 1879, Mary Cassatt had framed it. The frame was green. And it create here, let me give you an example. So the image on the left, it may be similar to what was how the painting was originally framed. The right is how it's framed now, except for this particular exhibition, they've gone back and sort of tried to recreate the original frame. Unfortunately, the original green frame no longer survives. Presumably, an earlier owner decided they didn't like it. Now,
Isn't it? It seems like it's greenish, but it's kind of
yeah,
gold and green.
I mean, it's not like green like your Christmas tree green. Certainly not, right? So it's not like a heavy duty green. But I will tell you that even when Mary Cassatt showed this originally, with this green frame, not all of her contemporaries agreed with that green frame choice. Edmond Renoir, who is an art critic and the brother of a fellow impressionist, he said, her frames were smeared with red or green. They were very ugly and in the worst taste. However, Mary Cassatt, she remained committed to that kind of artistic exploration. She, like many of her friends and colleagues, Degas Pizarro, for example, they experimented with frames as a way of signaling the innovation, the modernity of their paintings.
Oh, we have a comment from Catherine. She says she's more interested in being seen than anything else. And I'd love to hear more from Catherine about, tell us more about what you're getting at, if you don't mind unmuting and telling us.
Okay, it's really the impression I have and of her face and everything, but really look in the back, there is a guy with his opera glasses looking at her.
Oh, we see that. Okay, where do you see that person? Is that like right to the left of her head?
Yeah.
Yes, I see what you're saying, Catherine. I have to say, for as many times as I've looked at that, I've never noticed that.
Great
It's
observation.
right, like you look at the bow on her left shoulder, and if you go right up that into the loge, you can see. Let me see if I can make it bigger. Right here. Can you see? I don't know. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I see exactly what you're saying, Catherine. Okay. Now, it's interesting, and I always like when people do this. So thank you, Catherine. You're talking about how this woman, she's at the opera to be, it's part of it's being seen. And that leads me to my next work. Thank you. All right, this is the next word. Talk about, looking at people and being seen. That's exactly what this is in this particular painting. And let me compare, then you can compare these two works side by side. And what are some of the, let's compare and contrast. What are some of the differences? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, like it's so much darker on the left, and she's wearing a black dress. And it probably, that was much more common at that time, right? Than the brighter dress that her sister is wearing.
I know, that's a little bit lower, right? You got that decolletage.
And then this one really gives you like, yeah, it like the observation is kind of central to the in my mind. I don't know. Does anyone else? What do other people think of this? You're welcome to either unchat or unmute or to chat. You don't have to unchat though.
I love the guy who's looking at his through his binoculars at her, and she's looking at hers through someone else, to someone else.
Like a little love triangle or something.
Exactly, Gail. Exactly, right? So Mary Cassatt, she felt that painting it needed to break free of all those old methods and adapt to the new world. So she found her answer to that in the demand for a new kind of painting in the work of the Impressionists, which is where she showed these works. These were now, if you're not familiar with the Impressionists, they were small circle of independent French artists. And she honestly approved of their disdain for those juried exhibitions, and she soon adopted their experimental techniques.
I want to call out Ron's comment. The mother is checking up on her daughter. So before you had those apps that you could use to track your kids, this is kind of how you had to do it.
Right, you and your binoculars. Oh, I like that. Now, I will tell you, this painting on the left in the Loge, it was the first of Mary Cassatt's Impressionist paintings to be displayed in the United States. And when it was shown in Boston in 1879, critics described the picture as striking, adding that Mary Cassatt's paintings surpassed the strength of most men. Now, entertainments such as these, like going to the opera, going to the theater and the racetrack, those were all very popular among Parisians who enjoyed, these diversions for not only the show, but as Catherine mentioned and alluded to, but also for the opportunity to be seen by their peers. And, Impressionists, we have all seen Impressionist works where they absolutely paint these spectacles of modern French life in the theater. And, you get those dazzling lights that we saw and those reflections that we see in this work on the left, on the right. Many of the male artists, like Renoir and Degas, they painted these beautiful women in these theater boxes, almost as if these women were on display in these gilded frames. Now, I will tell you, at the time, the movement of middle-class women throughout the city was highly constricted, especially if they wanted to appear respectable. But they were allowed to attend the theater matinees on their own. So we see this in the left-hand side, of course, we see this high collar dress that this woman is wearing. And that's, of course, very much in contrast to that sort of shimmering, much lower décolletage of the woman in the woman in the Loge. And this, this black dress that's much higher up, that suggests perhaps an afternoon viewing. And as Catherine and I think Gail both, referred to, we see that gentleman in this particular painting, and he's looking through his binoculars at our subject here, at this woman who is looking through her binoculars. And then, of course, we are looking at both of them, thereby sort of completing that little triangle. And so, yes, absolutely, this particular work by Mary Cassatt, it's sort of exploring and breaking down those traditional boundaries between the observer and the observed, and the audience and the performer. So next, we're going to be looking at where Mary Cassatt is working in pastels instead of oils, which these two works are in. Now, this particular work in pastel is a work in pastel. Now, pastel is a combination of finely ground pigment with a type of binder, usually a sticky substance like gum or glue. And yes, these really are Mary Cassatt's pastels. Now, pastel was a medium that was very transportable. So when Mary traveled back to North America from France, she actually traveled with boxes of these pastels. So she loved the mobility. It also gave her a kind of spontaneity that she wouldn't have had if she'd worked with oils. Now, we were talking about Mary Cassatt using some different techniques. In this particular work, she used, brilliant touches of fresh pastels and bold streaks of metallic paint, frequently using moisture to create a multi-layered surface. Through the years, Mary Cassatt produced pastels on various types of supports, including paper adhered to canvas, and canvas alone. And for those works, for this particular work, she used a canvas coated with a ground, embedded with pumice or coarse fiber to create a rough surface that would hold the powdery pastels more securely. This pastel is much more about the fan it's just as much about that fan as it is about the figure holding the fan. All right, now X-ray and infrared imagery, it shows what lies beneath that pastel layer. Here we're able to see that Mary Cassatt first chose an unusual medium. It's called distemper, and it's a type of paint that's mixed with glue. She lays down a layer of distemper to build up a structure for the fan. She actually didn't really like the effect of the distemper, so she sort of scrapes it off. But even with the naked eye, we can still see on the left here what's left of the fan. It creates a little bit of a shadow where she made those changes. It left a little bit of a crusty layer that she then built her pastel layers on top of.
We have a question from Gail. She says,
Yes.
I've always wondered about pastels. Is the texture like chalk or crayon? Is it kind of in between the two? Like, do we know?
I've always thought it was a bit like chalk, honestly. I know when I personally see a lot of, when I go to museums and I see pastels, a lot of them are covered with like a glass. And I always think, as people just sort of, even as you just sort of walk by the air movements, that was always my understanding, that the air movements can potentially sort of disturb the pastel on the work.
Yeah, don't be sneezing around the
Yeah,
pastel.
don't be sneezing, don't be fanning yourself. No, none of that. But I guess if it's under glass, it doesn't matter, right? That being said.
I think it is a delicate thing to conserve, that's for sure.
Right, very delicate. So yeah, no sneezing, no, yeah, be careful. Okay, so we talked about the distemper, we talked about what's sort of left over from this. And Mary Cassatt probably experimented a bit with pastels very early in her career, but it wasn't until in the late 1870s when she was in Paris and invited to display works with the Impressionist group that she really sort of embraces the material. It shows her immediate command of the medium and her desire to push that medium in new directions. Okay, we've seen 3 works of women inside the theater and the opera. Next, let's move outside. Now, what do you think is so modern about this particular work? Anybody have any thoughts?
The
I
woman
wanna-
is
I wanna-
driving. Oh my God.
Exactly, right? That's exactly what, right? Exactly. Here we see a woman driving, and in a moment of, great independence and autonomy, she's driving this carriage through Paris. Of course, nowadays, we don't think anything about a woman driver, but in Mary
You
Cassatt's
can get
day,
one of those self-driving carriages, right?
yeah, right? That's
Waymo.
Hey, I'm kind of in favor. If I don't have to drive and look for a parking space, yes, please. All right, but in Mary Cassatt's day, the moment when this particular painting was created in the early 1880s, it was only really the very, very wealthy women who could experience something like this level of autonomy. There was a postcard at the time about women drivers. Now, I don't know if this postcard is saying women drivers are so bad that this bicyclist was run over, or if he was just so stunned that there was a woman driver that he fell off his bike.
Well, she's supposed to give him 3 feet, right? Isn't that the law?
I know, right? So I don't quite know what it's saying, but regardless, it's probably not good news, right? Right.
Because he's not even wearing a helmet.
Exactly. It's his own fault, doggone it. He should be like 3 feet away and wearing his helmet. What's up with that, right? Now, I will tell you, at the time, Parisian parks and gardens were some of the few public spaces where respectable women could move freely in society. The models for this painting were, once again, Mary Cassatt's sister, Lydia, and Degas' young niece, Odile. The setting is the Bois de Boulogne, which is a large park that was a popular meeting place, and a scenic destination for pleasure rides. Now, we see here that Mary Cassatt honed in pretty tightly on her subjects. The horse has been cropped, the carriage has been cropped. So, kind of an unusual composition, if you will. Odile, the young girl, she's dressed in pink and she's sitting pretty quietly. She's maybe daydreaming, or she seems a little lost in thought. And that, of course, is very much in contrast to Lydia, who's driving this. She's staring very intently. She's very much in control of this vehicle and of this horse. And that kind of suggests maybe the seriousness to which she's approaching this particular task. Now, here, Mary Cassatt, she's exploring this outdoor setting and this, degree of autonomy that upper class women enjoyed. And absolutely, driving in the park was something that the Cassatt sisters enjoyed, particularly after 1879, when the family acquired a small carriage and Bichette, the horse, which you see partially depicted here. So absolutely, driving gave these women a sense of independence that women like Mary and Lydia Cassatt enjoyed. May Alcott, the younger sister of Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women, she wrote to her family in 1877 about an evening spent in Paris with the Cassatt sisters and their friends. She wrote, "Afterwards we drove home in the soft air, leaving the Mrs. Stearnses at their door and telling them what a nice lark we considered it." They'd been out driving at the Bois de Boulogne at 10 o'clock at night, going out for ice cream. Now, meanwhile, of course, we see this anonymous driver in that family servant, and he's sort of relegated to the back, that rear-facing seat. Yes, we know the name of the horse, but we don't know the name of the male servant. But as we look at him, right, you can't see many of his features. And interestingly enough, that black suit that he's wearing, it sort of visually connects him to the dark horse. And that absolutely is sort of a very stark contrast in comparison to the much more colorful dresses of these female sitters.
Do you
All right.
get a sense of is there a humor to this, do you think? Is it serious? Is it kind of humorous that he's in the back like that? What's your take on it, Bernice?
Okay, I think it's humorous, but that's with my, 2024 eyes. That I'm thinking, that, and plus, of course, I think it's a little funny that, we know the horse's name, but not the guy's name. But okay. But I don't know if at the time it was considered humorous, to be fair.
That's the thing, to get ourselves in the minds of someone in the 19th century, what their reaction would be.
Okay, I wasn't sure if there was another comment. I was waiting, but okay. Now, all right, so we've had a chance to look at 4 different out-of-the-home scenes. But of course, Mary Cassatt, she's much more known for her indoor and domestic scenes.
You
And
look very handsome now with your new hair.
I was going to say, I'm sorry?
Very gorgeous.
This is a gorgeous painting, right? This looks fantastic. I hope, if somebody paints me, I want to look this good too. Absolutely. Now, as I said, Mary Cassatt, she's of course much more known for her indoor and domestic scenes. And let's be honest, what's more domestic than family? So here is a painting that of Mary Cassatt's brother Alexander with his son Robert. Now, I will tell you, during his lifetime, Alexander was probably the more famous of the two. Much more famous than Mary. He was, in fact, the 7th president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Rodney just changed his background. Yes, that same railroad that we see.
It's a very good railroad to own. I have owned that railroad at times, and if you can get at least $25 every time someone lands on it.
Now, I will tell you, he made some money off that railroad too. He was, like I said, the 7th president, and it was the Pennsylvania Railroad. He was one of the most powerful businessmen in America. In fact, here is a portrait of Alexander by none other than John Singer Sargent. The Pennsylvania Railroad, it was one of the largest corporations in the world at the time. Here's a statue of Alexander, which originally resided in New York City's Pennsylvania Station. And during World War II, he had his own Liberty ship named after him, the SS A.J. Cassatt. Not to be outdone, Mary Cassatt too. She had her own Liberty ship. However, hers was transferred to the Soviet Union shortly after it was launched in 1943, and it was commissioned with the name Odessa. Hence, we see the Cyrillic on the side of the ship. Okay, but back to Alexander, that 7th president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, as you look at these 2 paintings, what could you tell? I mean, it's the same guy, but what do you think?
Yeah, we see a much more casual side to him on the left. He looks so serious on the right. He looks like a titan of industry, but on the left, you get the sense of like this tender family moment that she's revealing to us the private side of him.
Absolutely, right? John Singer Sargent, on the right-hand side, titan of industry. I mean, like he is like, I am the 7th president of one of the biggest companies just one of the biggest companies, honestly.
Yeah, Paco says he looks patriotic on the right.
Ooh. Very proud, very, upstanding. Absolutely.
But don't be trying to ride the railroad without buying a ticket.
No,
I
no, no, no,
don't think
no.
he's going to look too kindly on that.
No, 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 no. That affects the bottom line, no question, right? You don't get to ride for free.
Kid looks like his father, Catherine says. Yeah,
Exactly, Catherine. So we see, as the son, Robert is sitting next to his father. We see, they're both looking the same way. We see, they're both their gazes are focused the same way. We see those flushed cheeks, and that black clothing. And it's a really intimate moment. As Alexander's sitting, he's reading his paper. He's put it down, and Robert's got his arm around his dad. Now here we see Mary Cassatt using the color black, which was a color that was so unpopular with the Impressionists. It's pretty innovative, and she's using it in a really innovative and in an interesting way. I think Catherine was mentioning, we're looking at those dark clothes and how it almost with the clothes, it almost merges into one person. It's like one person with two heads.
We have a nice comment from Gail contrasting the sergeant with the Cassatt.
Okay.
So maybe go back to that. Yeah, then the Cassatt, it looks kind of lost, worried, distracted. In the sergeant, he's confident commander of the universe. Left thumb in pocket is sort of weird. Yeah.
Oh, do you think it looks a little too casual?
I don't know.
Yeah,
What's in
it seemed very strange for the time. Like maybe that was his hesitancy depicted by Sargent.
Oh. So he's quite the titan of industry, but there's like a little bit of he's holding back a little bit, maybe with that hand in the pocket.
He wants to make sure he gets to own all the other railroads so that he can charge more than $25.
For that monopoly on the railroads,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it's nice to have one railroad, but have all four is really that's what you want.
I know, right? At that time,
monopoly.
That's no joke, right?
Gail's a big Sargent fan. I am too.
I'm a big Sargent fan. I've always said that's who I want to paint me if I could have anybody paint me, of course. Now, I will tell you this particular painting was painted in December of 1884 during a surprise visit to Paris by her relatives. Now, during the second half of the 19th century, Japan opened its doors to the world, and Europe became aware of Japanese art. And Japanese art became all the rage in Paris. Artists were particularly intrigued by woodblock prints, some of which were shown. Here is a poster from one of those shows. Now, these Japanese woodblock prints, of which I have an example here, became an example and something that Western painters wanted to experiment with. Its use of flat colors, clear lines, and those sort of textural patterns that were characteristic of these prints. Now, Mary Cassatt herself was enthralled. She said, "I dream of doing it myself, and I can think of nothing else," she wrote. So this is something that she created after taking inspiration from those Japanese prints. Mary Cassatt, she set out to produce that similar effect of those woodblock prints. She pioneered a new method of printing in color using copper plates and a technique of soft ground, dry point, and aquatint. No carving wood for Mary. Now, beginning in 1890, Mary collaborated with the printer, Modeste Leroy, to create 10 works, each using 2 to 3 plates depicting the daily lives of modern women. Now, she does credit Modeste Leroy in this sort of handwritten inscription below the image, and that acknowledgement was perhaps a nod to the labor associated with this project, or perhaps a nod to the Japanese tradition of including both the artist and the printer's signatures on the work. Now, the prints in her set of 10 made using this method, it made them sort of among her most significant works and among the most inventive in the history of modern printmaking. And she would make 25 copies of each of these 10 scenes for a total of 250 prints. This is the final print. And we're going to look in a little bit more detail to see how Mary and Modeste Leroy accomplished this. All right. So number one, you're going to draw the scene on a piece of paper. You're going to use, they used 3 equally sized copper plates to help create the print. Now, to make sure everything lines up, you're going to use a pin registration method. And don't forget to use it on all the copper plates. Now, we know Mary used this particular technique because we can see these pinholes right up here. You can see them. I've sort of outlined them here. Now, it might be a little bit easier for you to see it on this particular print, which is also, both of these prints are in the exhibition. And you can see these pinholes here on the top and the bottom. Okay, now we've got now to get this image on the copper plate, you need to apply soft ground. And soft ground is typically a mixture of grease, wax, asphaltum, and resin. And when heated, that soft ground may be evenly applied across the surface of the plate with a brayer. Now, that brayer is a crucial printmaking tool used to thinly apply the ink or the paint onto those printing plates. And you need to make sure to ensure even distribution of that color. Once the plate cools, the grease component keeps the ground tacky and soft, so it can be then lifted away in selected areas. All right, now transfer the scene onto the metal plate that's been coated with that soft ground, and don't forget to wrap the edges of the paper around the plate. Now, you're going to trace the drawing. Now, the action and pressure of the lines on those lines of the drawing will be enough to lift that soft ground from the plate. And after removing that paper from the plate, that soft ground will be on the underside of the paper. And here in this particular slide, the right side, of course, is the drawing, and the left, did I say that right? No, the left is the drawing, sorry, and the right is the underside of the drawing where the soft ground has actually been taken from the copper plate. Now, that soft ground, it's acid resistant, and it's going to protect the plate during the etching. The transfer reveals those lines on the bare copper plate beneath that layer of soft ground. Now, to etch those lines, in this example, ferric chloride was used to etch those lines on the copper plate. But based upon research and analysis done by the National Gallery of Art, Mary Cassatt likely used a different acid to etch her plates, such as Dutch mordant. Dutch mordant is a solution of 1 part hydrochloric acid and 9 parts potassium chloride. So some pretty caustic stuff. After about a minute, just enough to alter the surface sheen of the plate, you're going to place that in water to stop the etching process. And then to clean off the soft ground, you're going to apply mineral spirits and then dry. Okay, everywhere that was drawn with pencil is lightly etched onto the copper plate. And this is what Mary would have used as a guide when starting her dry point. Mary Cassatt used dry point to make these lines deeper. She could scratch additional lines to add details, but remember, this is a really unforgiving medium. You're scratching onto a copper plate. Whatever's on the copper plate is what's going to be printed later on. So be careful. Now, I will tell you, these are some of the examples of some of those dry point tools. And of course, the harder you press into the copper, the bolder the line will be. Now, the metal that is displaced by the scratches on the forms, on those form ridges, it's a characteristic feature of dry point, and it's called a burr along the incised lines. Think like plowing a field. To the left or to the right of the line, depending on how you angle the tool, you'll see a little bit of the copper away from the plate. In this particular image here, you can see that sort of copper colored line. That would have been the copper plate. And then the black, that would be the ink. So you can see, right, a little bit of the copper plate has come away, a little bit of the copper plating has come away from the plate itself. After the plate's complete, you use a stiff card to spread the ink and push the ink into the scratches. You need to, after that, don't forget to remove that excess ink from the plate using a crisp fabric called a tarlatan. Next, you're going to place a dampened sheet of paper on the plate. Wet paper is used, so the fibers will press further into the plate to pick up the ink. You're going to place that plate and the paper through the printing press, and it'll transfer that image onto the paper. This is the first state without any color. You can see what it looks like. Here's a closer look. Now, while there's still ink on that paper, you're going to use that paper to print and help transfer the image onto the two other unused copper plates. You're going to place small pins in the printed registration marks here. You can see those little pin marks. Don't forget to find those on the plates as you carefully put the piece of paper down. After you place that paper on the plate, you're going to remove the pins. You're going to press that unused plate and paper through the printing press, and you're going to repeat that for the third plate. Each time, of course, you do this, the ink will be a little bit lighter on the copper plate, but it's fine to use as a guide, evidently. For the colored areas that we saw, there's different inks that would have been applied to different plates and then printed onto the paper. Mary Cassatt used an aquatint technique to create the shapes in the aquatint. All other areas are protected with an acid-resistant material, so they don't get etched, and they will retain the ink. In this particular image, to print the flowers, you're going to paint the material around the flowers. And don't forget to do this on the other two plates. All right, once that aquatint is applied, right, you can see once it's applied, the exposed areas will etch and they will hold the ink. Now, once that stop out is dry, you're going to dust an aquatint rosin. Now, you can see here they're using a shaker. This is for demonstration purposes. The professional printers probably would have used a rosin bag. Now,
Same as what we use in baseball, by the way.
oh, really? Oh, okay. See, sports, art. There we go. All right. Now that you've already dusted this with that aquatint rosin, you're going to heat the rosin. You're going to heat that rosin dusted plate to fuse the rosin to the plate. And that white powder is going to become clear when melted and then fused to the plate. Each tiny grain of that rosin creates an island of acid-resistant material. And that acid eats around each of the grains to create a roughness to the plate that holds the ink during the printing process. Each plate goes back into the acid bath to etch. However, this time it's going to be for a lot longer. Before it was like for a minute or two. Now it's going to be for about 30 minutes. Since more of the copper will be eaten away, that plate's going to hold more ink during that printing process, and that'll create a deep, rich tone in the final print. All right. Once that etching is complete, you're going to clean off those plates. All right, time to ink the plates. Now, Mary Cassatt would have applied different colors of ink to each of the 3 plates. And she also applied multiple colors to the same plate using a technique called à la poupée. Now, carefully applied colors to the areas, but when the excess ink is wiped away, with that tarlatan that you can see here, when that's wiped away, the colors will blend a little bit into each other. Here you can see the effects of that in the little areas that I've outlined with that box. You'll see a little bit of a blending in the flowers. There's a little bit of blue in the flowers. Now, Mary Cassatt would have decided which colors to blend and which ones not to blend. For example, the pink in her dress would have looked muddy and lose some of its definition if it had been blended with the adjacent blue. So the pink and the blue were printed on separate plates, so they don't blend. All right, now that these plates are inked, it's time to print. The first sheet is printed on a blank sheet of paper and put through the press, okay? Layer 1, it's done. All right, don't forget, you're gonna put the pin in again, right? Don't forget to use that pin registration system when printing on the subsequent plates. Here you can see the addition, right? You can see the addition of the pink and the green flowers, as well as the blue of the dress. And this, of course, is during the second pass. And after registering and printing the final plate, here we have the finished product. Now, I don't know about you, but after all this talk about dry point, soft ground, and aquatint, I feel like this girl in this other Mary Cassatt painting. Now, I will tell you, when Mary Cassatt submitted this work to the Paris Exposition Universelle, it was rejected. Any ideas?
Might have been seen as like too casual a subject or something. It's, you know, the girl's got her legs open and it's not like a very dainty pose, right?
No, she's not sitting like a lady, as my cousin would have said to me.
Yeah, like in 19th century sensibilities, maybe this is a little bit, you know, much. Although I have to say, like her in the chair with that dog across the way, it's just really charming, you know.
Very charming, right? But not very ladylike, as my mother would have said. Now, it's also one of the reasons perhaps that it was rejected, in addition to our model's very informal pose, is what I'm going to call it. You can see that loose brushwork, which would not have been accepted in the salons back then. We see this young girl, of course, in this domestic scene, that those visible brush strokes were actually hallmarks in the Impressionists. The composition, it looks, honestly, it's a little asymmetrical. The viewpoint's a little raised. It's a little shallow. The space is a little shallow. And the cropping, honestly, it's a little abrupt. But those actually also show the influence of Japanese art. Now, this girl was the child of a friend of Degas. And, you know, she's sort of sprawling, unself-conscious. But she's also being kind of dwarfed by that adult furniture. This painting, as I mentioned, it's actually often cited as an example of Degas' influence on Mary Cassatt. And they certainly had quite a bit in common, if only in terms of their backgrounds. Both were born in upper middle class families. They were children of bankers. They both had strong connections to America. Degas' mother and grandmother were both Americans, and he stayed with the family. With his family in New Orleans from 1872 to 1873. And in a letter to French art dealer Ambroise Voila, Mary Cassatt wrote that Degas not only advised her as she painted this particular work, but he even worked on the background with her. Now, recent cleanings and restoration and some technical analysis, they've all been instrumental in identifying Degas' role in this particular work. The paint surfaces in the corner of the room beyond that furniture, it shows evidence of having been scraped or rubbed. And that was a technique that Degas often used, but Mary Cassatt didn't. Now, infrared imaging also reveals that Mary Cassatt had initially used a horizontal line to mark the edge of the floor. We can see that with the straight line across, right? And there was a single back wall, and that was just parallel to the picture plane. Degas made the space, he made it more dynamic by adding a corner. He added that junction of the two walls, and that sort of introduced that diagonal to expand the room spatially. Now, with that wide diagonal helping sort of define the interior, Mary Cassatt had to make some adjustments to her composition. She repositioned that armless chair in the background. And she also had to reconsider where the dog was, right? So we see that straight line, that was Mary Cassatt. The dotted yellow line, that was Degas. And that blue circle with the dots, that was where the dog was originally. But the dog had to get moved, right? Didn't work compositionally anymore.
The dog got to take a nap, so I think it probably wasn't too unhappy about that.
I know, I think it's an upgrade myself. I'd like that nap too on that nice comfy chair. It looks pretty good. And so, you know, she had to move the dog, she had to move the couch. These things got moved. Now, this last work we're going to look at is actually what Mary Cassatt is most known for, right? Women and children. And that's a subject that Mary Cassatt returns to time and time again in her work from 1880 onward. The subject of caregiving, specifically looking after children. And many of these works have been given titles that suggest that they are mothers and children However, Mary Cassatt actually would usually pay her own or her friends' domestic employees, her cook, her seamstresses, her maids. They often modeled for her, and she paid them to model. It was work. And these models would pose with children from her own family or a neighbor's family. Art dealers frequently titled these images as mothers and children, although the subjects weren't necessarily related. Also, these images were carefully thought through works. These weren't spontaneous scenes. Now that you know that, does it change how you look at these works?
I think it's, you have to know that to really go into this idea of like she's calling this out. But I think it's kind of interesting that most people would see these images and not know that, right?
Right, absolutely. I mean, until this, I always thought they were mothers and children. Honestly, that's what you tell me on the net. That's what the title says. Okay, fine.
And did I interrupt was someone else trying to say something? Because go ahead and unmute if you were. Nope. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Well, we've seen how Mary Cassatt used a new technique for printing. Now, in this particular work, we're seeing how she's actually using the wooden end of a paintbrush to create a design on the woman's dress. Here's a close-up. It's kind of a modern technique. Although Rembrandt did use it, I found out the other day, but right, I mean, but I still think to use the wooden end of your paintbrush, it's kind of unusual. Now, Mary Cassatt was active into the 1910s, and by her later years, she was able to witness the emergence of modernism in Europe and in the United States. However, her signature style remained consistent. By 1914, she was unable to continue making art. She had unfortunately developed cataracts in both eyes. Instead, she shifted her efforts towards the suffrage movement in the United States. As a savvy businesswoman, property owner, and professional artist, Mary Cassatt felt strongly that women should have the right to vote. In 1915, she organized an exhibition with the art collector and her friend, Louisine Havermeyer, to benefit women's suffrage. The exhibition featured about 20 works by Mary Cassatt, as well as a few works by fellow impressionist Degas, who didn't support women's suffrage. Many of her female relatives, particularly those in Philadelphia, were not supportive of suffrage. Frustrated with their lack of support for this cause, Mary Cassatt sold some of her best paintings rather than leave them to her anti-suffrage relatives. Her commitment to suffrage was built upon the ways that she had defined they were built upon the ways that she had defied social expectations placed upon women. Throughout her life, Mary Cassatt, she defined herself through her professional work. In a passport application from 1918, she states, "I am an American artist, temporarily living abroad for professional work. I have been for long periods in France, studying and practicing art, my profession." So I hope the next time you look at some of Mary Cassatt's works, you'll think of her not only as an artist of women and children, but also as an artist who pushed and challenged the artistic boundaries through her materials and through her techniques.
Yeah, and Bernice, I just want to call out, like you gave us all that information about the printmaking. This
Yes.
is something she invented, right? Like she was aware of the Japanese wood blocks.
And this was her take on that, to create something similar. I mean,
Yeah.
honestly, after reading all that and going through it, I really do feel like that young girl sprawled on that chair. I mean, oh my gosh, I'm exhausted. I cannot imagine. And I will tell you, you get these prints and that all important burr, as it goes to the press, each time that burr gets flattened and flattened. So you can't get like, I don't know, millions of these prints off this thing, because each time that burr is going to flatten, so you don't get that sort of feathery effect on each subsequent, I guess, pass of that plate as it goes through the press.
She was very hardworking, but
Oh, yeah.
also this very really maybe the greatest innovator of the Impressionists, right?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, she was dedicated to printing. She bought her own press. Now for these, she sought a professional printer. Yes, I would too. Oh my goodness. But yeah, she bought her own press.
Yeah.
I was amazed with that. And honestly, I was impressed. Go
We
to
have a
that
question
level.
from Lorna. She says, sorry if I missed this, but am I correct that she never married?
Yes, that is my understanding. Yes, she did not marry. She did not have children. She and her brother, Alexander, were quite close. And she and her sister Lydia were quite close. Lydia died very much quite young, but yes, she did not have any children. She did not marry. Mary Cassatt did not marry or have children. Would she have time? Oh my gosh, thinking of those prints. Oh my gosh, that would just take me. Well, yeah, wouldn't have time.
Yeah, that's those are her real, that's her great contribution.
Yeah.
Question from Gail: how many etchings did Cassatt do? I don't know if we know the exact number, but it was a fair number, right?
So I know for this, it was a series that she did 10 modern images of women, and then you figure that, I mean, there were 10 of those, right? And she redid those, she printed several copies of those. I think, what was the number? But I don't, that was, I think those were like, but etchings are different than dry point. It's a different technique, and it's a different, how it appears is a little bit different.
Yeah.
Well,
Then
isn't it the
Is dry-
etchings and the dry point supposed to, get more money for what she does because she does repetition. I mean,
You
it's
know,
a new
right.
technology.
Right. I do
Yeah.
wonder, and I think that's a fair point. I do wonder, this is, I mean, yeah, she comes from a very privileged background, but her father would pay for her living expenses, but not her art supplies. So I do wonder if part of the printing was in response to the fact that she did have to pay for her own art supplies. Which,
Sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah, as opposed to painting one by one.
Nikki, by the way, wants us all to know that the Asian Art Museum will be free on December 1st. So
Ooh,
what is that? That's like Sunday?
Sunday, that's on Sunday.
yes.
I don't know anything more about it, but I guess it's probably online.
Right, see some Japanese wood prints there.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what's up right now at the Asian Art Museum, but yes, this is at the Legion, but yes.
Bernice, really want to thank you. You did a lot of work on this, and it's a great presentation and helps understand just how amazingly innovative she was.
Yes, I am not gonna, I have to say, I am not gonna look at Mary Cassatt the same way that I did, before I looked at this exhibition, and before I did I looked a little bit more into her prints.
Yeah, and it's up into next year. I'm forgetting the date that it closes, but you've got some time to see it. But I would definitely, I think this is a must-see exhibition at the Legion of Honor.
Yes, particularly, yeah, especially the prints now that we can appreciate. I know I appreciate the prints much more than I did when I first saw the exhibition. Because I know I personally, when I think of Mary Cassatt, I do think of women and children, and you think these sentimental pictures, oh geez. But there's more to it than just that.
Yeah. The technique is really something that the exhibition reveals.
Right. And she wasn't afraid to work, clearly.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, she's not just like, before I heard she was the only woman among the Impressionists. You think, oh, well, she's just part of this movement. But no, she's a great pioneer in her own right. Cool. Well, thanks again, Bernice. We'll hopefully have you back again on Art Viewing Adventures in 2025. I'm working on a new set of programs. We will be back in 2 weeks. We will be meeting a San Francisco artist named Emily Dash, who is real interesting. Nikki, let me turn it back.
All of you, by the way.
And Paco won't be joining us because Paco has a new job with Salesforce. So we will be recording our programs and posting them on YouTube as we will with this one.
Great. Good. Yeah.
Nikki, tell us what's next.
Oh, okay. So thanks everybody. Paco, best wishes on that new job. That's wonderful. Congratulations. We usually partner up with by promoting Boomer Music, right? And Boomer Music is going to be tomorrow. Tuesday the 26th. Great girl groups. Starts at 6:10. Great girl groups. Let me see. Who would that be?
The Supremes.
Yeah, the Supremes.
That's definitely one of them.
Yeah.
I look forward to that, Nikki and Rodney.
Yeah, I think that's
the Temptations. No, the Temptations were men. The Ronettes.
Oh, yeah.
Rich will have he'll have a great lineup as he
He's
always.
amazing. He's amazing. He's just the walking history encyclopedia of rock music. Yeah. And other kinds of music. He's just wonderful. So that'll be tomorrow, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks, like you said. And if you want to find our calendar, we're at I put it in the chat. It's sfcommunityliving.org. You can find our events there. And Bernice, thank you again. I love the graphic behind you, the beautiful bridge to TI and Treasure Island, where my parents spent many days enjoying the World's Fair there in 1939. So it's always pleasant to see. I would have to connect everything back to my family, Rodney. Sorry. I'm a true San Franciscan.
Yeah, and definitely want to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. That's coming up.
Yep. Happy Thanksgiving. So,
Bernice and Rodney and
Thank you,
Nikki.
Paco.
thanks, Paco. Have a good week, everybody. We'll see you soon.
All right.
right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so
Bye.
much.
Guys,
Take
good week.
care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Happy Thanksgiving.